Good afternoon. My name is Leah Ryan, and it's an honor and a privilege to welcome you to the first virtual session of the 2022 Charleston Literary Festival. Back in 2000, when the world shut down, we created a fully virtual festival experience, and it was a bright spot in a very dark time. Sharing the power of great literature and ideas over the internet was an experience I'll never forget. But I, of course, am thrilled that the world has opened back up. I missed hugs and handshakes, and I can't wait to welcome many of you to Charleston, South Carolina in person. But I'm still glad that we learned to Zoom. Virtual spaces like this create opportunities to speak with fascinating people across time zones and oceans, from our living room to yours. Right now, we're going to hear from two very fascinating people. First, we have Nick Hornby, whose 1995 best-selling novel High Fidelity captured the ethos of my own music-obsessed, record store-dwelling generation. High Fidelity became a successful film starring the great John Cusack, and more recently a series starring Zoe Kravitz. Nick's later books include About a Boy, that movie starred Hugh Grant, and Fever Pitch, which starred Jimmy Fallon. He's basically a best-selling novelist and a box office sensation. Today he's here to tell us about Charles Dickens and Prince, and his new book, which tracks the unlikely parallels between them. Let me tell you, it's unexpected. Chatting with Nick today about these two creative geniuses is John Mullan, who's pretty brilliant himself. A professor of English at University College London, he's an expert in 18th century literature, the author of the profoundly entertaining book, The Artful Dickens, and was so great on screen in 2020 that we couldn't wait to bring him back. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Nick Hornby and John Mullan.
I have interviewed Nick before about, on more than one occasion, about his fiction. And in a way, this book, sort of, although it's a surprising coupling, didn't surprise me so much once I started reading it, because one of the things that I know about Nick from reading his books, as well as from meeting him, is his sort of omnivorous appetite for all sorts of kinds of culture, from sport to high literature, and an appetite which often brings them together in the same sort of paragraphs or phrases in his books. But this is a kind of an unlikely one to on first glance, Dickens and Prince. And I wanted to start, Nick, by asking you, actually, by going to the very end. I'm not going to do any sort of spoilers, but going to the very end of your book, in the last paragraph, you say, in a way, looking back on Dickens and Prince, this book is about work. And apart from the fact that you love Dickens and you love Prince, which is one reason for bringing them together, there are many more reasons. And I wonder if you could say something about why you ended up saying that Gradgrindian thing at the end. This book is about work. What is it that they have in common that made you say that?
Well, their output was phenomenal. I think there was a recent estimate that Prince, who has been dead for a few years now, recorded enough to provide us with a new album every few months for the next 30 or 40 years. It might be more than that, actually. And Dickens, I mean, the novels were huge, and that was really a very small part of what he did with his life. And there was the social reform and the editorship of newspapers and magazines, and his letters. There are, I think, 12 volumes of letters that are as big as the novels. And I think if you looked at those letters and you'd written them yourself, you'd think, yeah, that was a pretty good life. That plus however many kids he had. 9, was it? And
10, I think.
10 kids. 10 kids and the letters and the walks. You think there's no time for anything else. But he, of course, became one of our great novelists. And I am inspired by people working hard and creativity. And I feel much more of a kinship to those people who just want to get on with the next thing than those who spend 10 years polishing a book before they turn it in.
Yeah, I mean, there was a kind of, I felt almost overwhelmed actually at the beginning when you were saying about Prince's double album, Sign of the Times, which I do sort of, which I realize I haven't listened to for a while, but has been a favorite of mine in the past. And it's a double album. And then you referred to the fact, which I didn't know, that there is a kind of deluxe version of this. Correct me if I'm getting the terminology wrong, where you get all the sort of tracks that that didn't make the cut, that didn't eventually get in it. And there's another 65 songs.
Yes.
And there was a part of me which thought, I'm not sure I can cope with that, actually. I think I can cope with 2 albums, maybe, but 65 more songs.
Well, there is an argument to be had about whether it's a good thing or not for all this stuff to come out. I think the more the merrier, and the original double album is still there, and you don't have to go any further than that if you don't want to. But I do think he was a genius, and that was one of his peak periods of creativity. So to have access to this stuff, I think, is extraordinary. And I counted up. The 65 extra songs is more than the Eagles recorded in the 1970s. But he did this for quite a few of his records. There was a Purple Rain, which wasn't quite as expansive as Sign of the Times, but it was extraordinary what he did.
And as you say, Dickens, I mean, you mentioned the 12 volumes of his letters, of course. I mean, he actually destroyed loads of his letters. It almost certainly, wouldn't it have been, if we actually had the letters he wrote, it would have been vastly more, I suppose. And
yes.
So it's not just sort of work, is it? I mean, these 2 characters, these 2 creators, seem as if they are, I don't know, there's something copious about them, isn't there? Something,
yeah,
something generously unstoppable, as it were.
Yes, it never feels like it's ground out. It feels like they just couldn't stop it, and I like that feeling of copiousness. And I think that, well, we'll get on to what costs were, but
Yes.
I would have thought that sleep was one of the big costs.
Yes, and I mean, I mean, one cost, I guess, I know more about Dickens's life than about Prince's life. I have a sort of Wikipedia version of Prince's life in my head, I think, some of which was corrected by your book. But I do know quite a lot about Dickens's life, and I guess one of the costs would have been to quite a lot of people close to Dickens, that he was a sort of variously impossible person. Whether you although lots of people actually were very fond of him, but I mean, to live with him, even to work with him to some extent, to be in his company could be energizing, but also paradoxically completely exhausting too. I mean, do you think Prince was also an impossible person to be with?
Well, I think that Prince seemed to have been quite shy in a way that clearly Dickens wasn't. And I think that he didn't do a lot of socializing. I don't think there were an enormous number of people close to him apart from other musicians. So I think they're quite different in that respect. I mean, he had a lot of women in his life, but never for very long. And sadly, he only had a family for a few weeks. His child died. But I think he got up in the morning, started to record, and played in the evening. And then when he'd finished playing in the evening, he'd play in the night. And that was pretty much his life.
And I mean, the picture you give of the two of them, and you do keep moving back and forth between them, is I mean, some I think some might think that what you give is a picture of not just two very creative people, but two obsessives, really. That they were in the grip of something rather than making decisions to do something.
Yes, they were absolutely in the grip of something. I don't think there was any choice about whether they worked or not, for example. Like, they just worked. And I suppose the other thing I've realized later that I was writing about was superstardom. And I don't know, you'll know more about this than me, John, but were there that many 19th century superstars who were known almost globally, but certainly Europe and America? I mean, Dickens cracked America, which very few artists did in the 19th century, and that they had to live with their superstardom almost from the moment that they began their careers, and that seems a very unusual situation to me, to be famous for 40 odd years and then drop dead.
Yeah, I know. I think that is extraordinary, and I think what you say is actually right. I think that there were famous writers before Dickens, but superstar seems about right, in that if he went out into a public place, he would quite likely be mobbed.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In the way that sort of, I wonder, I was going to say in the way that Prince might be, but I wonder, I should ask you, because some of the times in the book you say things like, a day or two before he died, or I can't remember, I'll probably get this wrong, Prince cycled to a record shop in Minneapolis and bought a couple of discs. And I think, Prince cycled? I mean, how did that work? Did he have bodyguards cycling with him? I mean, what happened then?
I think that Minneapolis might have been a place where people left him alone, and they knew that he had come from there and lived there. And I think most of the time I don't think he'd have done that in LA or New York. I have an interesting story that someone told me. A friend of theirs was in a nightclub, and this guy in the nightclub was, I think he's a bit of a ne'er-do-well, LA playboy, was in this nightclub with a lot of women, and a man came over and said, "Would you mind if Prince joined your table?" And he was rather shocked to hear it, and he looked, and there was a man hiding behind the pillar. He was very small, and Prince poked his head out. And he said, "No, of course, we'd be delighted." And Prince plonked himself in the middle of these women, but then sort of didn't know what to say. And the guy who was with the women started talking to him about music and told Prince he was a drummer, that he had a drum kit and he drummed sometimes. And Prince got really interested in this and wanted to know exactly what his kit was, exactly how it was set up, exactly what tension he used on his drums. And then Prince disappeared, and the guy came back and said, "Could I take your phone number?" And a week later, this guy got a phone call saying, "Would you come out to Prince's house in LA tonight at midnight?" And when he got there, he wandered around and he found an open door into a studio. And when he walked into the studio at midnight, there was his drum kit. Prince had remembered how it was set up and bought it. And it was exactly like he said. He sat down behind the drum kit. Prince came out and said, "Play something funky," which might be one of the most terrifying things to say to I think a white middle-aged amateur drummer. Anyway, he started playing, and Prince said, "Pretty good," and joined in on his guitar. And after a couple of minutes, Prince snapped his fingers, and a 12-piece band appeared, complete with a horn section and backing vocalists. And they played like that for an hour. And then Prince said, "Thank you very much for coming," and he never saw him again. But this seems to be some of how his relationships were built.
Yeah.
He has had a story that he was invited out to say hello to Prince in LA, and him and his producer spent a long time driving out there. And when they went, they answered the door they knocked on the door, were let in, and Prince literally came downstairs and said, "Hi, thank you for coming," and then disappeared again.
Well, perhaps there is a Dickensian parallel there, which isn't in your book, but you could have found room for. Which is, I think when you were introduced to Dickens, certainly if you were invited to his house or one of his houses, he only owned one of them, but anyway, he lived in more than one. You would quite often not just be invited to have something to eat and drink, but be told that you were going to take part in some amateur dramatics or charades or games, or Dickens was tirelessly interested in that. You know, he wasn't really interested in sitting around in sort of, you know, comfy chairs having a quiet conversation. He wanted a more general sort of activity. So his version of Prince asking you to jam would be Dickens saying, "Oh, well, we're going to do I've got the scripts here. We're going to do a performance of the Frozen Deep. Is that okay? And you're a starving explorer at the North Pole. Here's your part."
So
and that, you know,
yeah. So it's just restlessness plus a constant need to be entertained and to entertain.
Exactly. I think that's exactly right. I mean, maybe it'd be good now to talk a bit about your two artists' lives, really, and because after your introduction, your book, of course, you go back to their childhoods, and you find quite a lot to compare and to find similar in various ways between their childhoods. And I wonder if you could talk us through that a bit.
Well, the first and most obvious comparison is childhood poverty. That, you know, we all know that Dickens' family sort of completely came off the rails, and I don't think I'd realised that his dad was doing fine, but he just kept spending more than he earned until he ended up in a debtor's prison. I mean, it wasn't like he had a terrible job. He just was careless with his money. Prince was sort of abandoned both by his mother and his father. His mother left the family. He stayed with his father. He didn't get on with his father or stepfather. It was a stepfather, I think, and ended up living in a friend's basement when he was about 12 or 13. So I was talking in the book about how the story of the 20th century is or art in the 20th century is quite often terribly impoverished backgrounds, and then people went on to create something extraordinary. And Munro, James Dean, Marvin Gaye, all the big ones of the 20th century grew up like this. But it was possibly more unusual for a writer to have done so. And then, like I say, they were both incredibly famous and successful from a very early age. And I talked a little bit about Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours.
Yes.
You need 10,000 hours of practice, which basically neither of them had before they began to achieve what they achieved.
Yeah. I mean, they in some ways, although it's only in the kind of condescension of posterity one can say this, but in some ways, because they both were so successful, and so successful relatively young, in their 20s in both cases, their deprived backgrounds, including to some extent the deprivation of, love, encouragement, education, good education. In Dickens's case, he had maybe a couple of years education in his whole life, and said, incidentally, of the headmaster of the school he was sent to after he was released from the bracking factory, a man called Mr. James, he said he was quite the most ignorant man it has ever been my pleasure to encounter. So he didn't think much of what education he did get. But in retrospect, as I was saying, they almost look like opportunities, those deprivations. I mean, Of course, for most people they wouldn't be,
No,
but they
I'm
left.
careful about that. But I think it fuels a hunger that actually can never be satisfied. And I don't think it was for either of them. There was no sign that they were slowing down all that time. And it created a real need, financial insecurity, but also a general sense, possibly, of low self-esteem when they began, which could only be assuaged by produce. Yeah.
And do you think also maybe the fact that they were both self-made men, but self-made artistically as well as financially, so that, if Prince had gone to the Juilliard school and Dickens had gone to Cambridge, they in a way they couldn't have done it. They had to make their own art forms, didn't they?
They had to make their own art forms. I think if Prince had gone to the Juilliard and Dickens had gone to Cambridge, they would have been very impatient with the process. I think because they couldn't control it, and control was a big thing for both of them. And B, it would have slowed them up. I mean, it really would have. They wanted to do what they had to do very, very quickly. So Dickens and the Pickwick Papers, that wouldn't have come for 3 or 4 or 5 years after graduating, I wouldn't have thought. And he might well have gone on to a different job.
And maybe he also, I don't know, maybe I sometimes think also somebody would have been teaching him how to write polite prose, and nobody ever did teach him.
I have to say, there was a moment where I thought about going to journalism school and applied, and every day I thank God I didn't go. I mean, I'd probably be unemployed by now because of the way that particular branch of the media has gone. But I think being given the opportunity, or creating the opportunity for yourself to do what you want to do in your own time, is incredibly important for some people.
And you give in the chapter about their sort of early lives, you just talked now about how relatively young they were when they started really achieving things. You actually give a chart, don't you, of as it were, the first, what they did in their 20s.
What they did in their 20s, yes. And I mean, Oliver Twist and Purple Rain came out in the same year of their lives, and obviously they were both big ones for both of them.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is, you say towards the end of the book that, by the time they were in their late 50s, Prince looked as though maybe he was in his early 30s. And Dickens looked like an old man. And of course, in a way, I think with Prince, it's not difficult to sort of realize that he was so young. Partly maybe we're used to young pop stars, but also he was forever young. In my mind, he always looked young.
Yeah.
Whereas Dickens, it's more of a shift for us to realize that, he didn't grow a beard till he was in his kind of mid-40s or late 40s, I think. And that our image of that actually, when he became famous and relatively wealthy, he was a really, he was sort of like Prince. He didn't look so unlike him, actually. But he was a really young guy, and not this bewhiskered old gent that people think.
Well, he was a bewhiskered old gent who never reached the age of 60. So, I mean, given the people in the media now who are in their 50s and feel like they're still working towards something. The other thing about them, of course, is that they were both quite extravagant in their dress, and they were both dandies, and and that presentation was very important to them.
Yes, no, that is true. That's so true. That's something that actually hadn't occurred to me before. That but when I was re-listening to some Prince songs whilst and after reading your book, and of course, quite often you do that online, and you get a video of him with his extraordinary costumes.
Yes.
But of course, when Dickens first became a celebrity, one of the things that sort of sniffy literary contemporaries were most irked by was the fact that he had these dandyish waistcoats and colourful jackets and sort of frothing cravats, and that, you know, they didn't like that at all.
He was flash. Yeah.
Yes.
He was really flash. And that and his ability to speak directly to people. I mean, that's the other thing about Dickens that was probably unique, was that his audience went way beyond the usual book buying public. And as Claire Tomlin said, basically anyone who can read read him, which wasn't true of most of the people that have survived from the 19th century.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if we touched on it, if we could talk a bit about their sort of habits of composition, because you give a very vivid picture of Prince's kind of mad, I mean, just again, exhausting, slightly mad habits of composition, as if, well, to put it bluntly, you quote somebody, and this is a very good quote, I think, and you apply it to Prince because this is a man saying it about Prince, but you sort of apply it to Dickens as well. He couldn't wait on perfection, as if what both of them wanted to do was finish what really interested them at the moment, but as soon as it was finished, it was gone, and there wasn't going to be a second draft.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, it's very interesting to think about that, and all the advice that traditionally is given to writing students at writing schools. That first of all, draft, redraft, and the other thing is cut, and that sense of, what was the word that you used about both copiousness?
Copiousness, yes.
Copiousness. So that's another thing. Dickens, if he'd gone to a writing school, that would have been a disaster. I don't know what you think about Hard Times, but I think it's probably my least favourite Dickens.
Me too, yes.
Doesn't have that copiousness. Everything's cut to the bone, and it's just not very joyful in a way that even Bleak House is incredibly joyful in parts.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I agree with you. Hard Times is my least favourite, although, of course, like one of Prince's less successful albums, there's still some really good stuff in it.
Well, yes,
but Hard Times,
and and you know, still those characters from Hard Times entered the language. And Brad Grindian is not unfamiliar adjective. So even his misfires, I think, have lived on. But
yes.
I mean, that story about Dickens writing the Old Curiosity Shop, I mean, it's terrifying, really, that he realised that he was short of a serial because somebody was no good, that they were going to serialise in the magazine. And he had a short story, which he then turned into a huge novel, kind of on the hoof, without having planned or thought. I mean, I don't think he probably did very much anyway, but he must have started with more of an idea than he had with the Old Curiosity Shop. And the idea that you can do that to dig yourself out of a hole, professionally and financially, and students are studying it in the 21st century seems incredible to me.
Yeah, I wonder if there's an analogy between the way that Dickens composed, which I think I have quite a good idea of, having spent I quite a lot of time looking at his manuscripts and things, and the way that Prince would have composed new songs and a new album. Because I think what Dickens did was that you're absolutely right, there was no second draft. The printer got the first draft. And indeed, he said to somebody, I can't remember to whom, you know, who said, but your manuscripts are just, you know, almost illegible. It's terrible. Why don't you make a fair copy or get somebody else to? You can
Yeah.
pay somebody else to make a fair copy. And he said, oh, if you send a fair copy to the printers, they get the biggest idiot in the print shop to set up the print. But if you, he said, when they get my manuscripts, I get the best guy because they're so impossible to read. I get the master printer. But anyway, the point is, if you look at a Dickens manuscript, you see that he did revise a lot, but only sentence by sentence. So he would work and he would start. In the moment. And sometimes that would lead to him crossing out the whole thing and sort of almost starting again. But very often it would lead to full starts. And because he uses so much ink and his writing so small, it's a nightmare. You usually can't see what he originally wrote and then corrected.
Yeah,
so you get this
manuscripts.
You get this extraordinary thing of sort of complicated and painstaking revision, but only improvisationally, only at the moment. Once he's got the sentence, he moves on. I mean, is there an analogy between that and the way? Do we know how Prince worked when he was composing a song, when he was recording a song?
I think that he built songs in the studio to a certain extent. So he'd come with a narrative, with a melodic fragment or a riff or whatever, and because he could do everything himself, he could have a song recorded before anyone else turned up for work, pretty much. His poor engineer was the one who always had to be on tap. A rather interesting woman called Susan Rogers, who's about to bring out her first book she became, I think she's something like a psychologist. I can't remember the phrase, but it involves sound and psychology, I think. But Prince would just call her up whenever and say, "Can you be here in half an hour?" And that might be Christmas morning, or and he'd already have the shape of something. There's a rather great story she tells that's in the book about helping Prince to build his studio, and the very first time he recorded something was something for Sign of the Times, and the quality was awful. It sounded like the instrumentation was underwater, and she felt ill, seeing what was going wrong, and he didn't re-record it. He made it seem like a deliberate effect, and it's extraordinary that the need to move on. He even ploughed through that kind of technical difficulty. But yeah, it sounds kind of weird and cool, so we'll go with it.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, it's very complicated because Dickens, of course, even because of the serialization, because all his novels were serialized, he would have had the chance, if he'd wanted to take it, to do revision, because then, of course, his serialized novels were turned into books, and at that stage, if he'd wanted to, he could have rewritten stuff, but he almost never did,
because he wanted to get on.
He wanted to write the next novel, or go to the next play, or visit the next country, or whatever it was.
I do find the writing of two novels at once one of the most mind-boggling things about Dickens, because the sheer numbers of characters in each novel, the idea that you could have the capacity to keep them separate in your mind and to keep the stories separate, and yet to be working on them at the same time. I don't know how he did that. And that was one of the things that started me off, because Prince was making 3 albums at once with Sign of the Times.
Yeah, no, that is extraordinary. You give an extraordinary, descriptions of Prince. Sometimes he's working on several things of his own and other people's. I mean,
other people's, and trying to control other people's careers, and this rather strange thing that he always did, which was if he fancied somebody, they'd be in the studio making an album while having the relationship with Prince. But none of them really survived, but there were probably 10 or 12 albums that he produced for his lovers in the 80s in his studio. And that was,
Right.
as we say, just one of the things that he did.
There's a very interesting and I think inevitable chapter in your book about money. And I wonder if we could talk a bit about that, because, obviously both these men to some extent wrote for money and both made lots of money. But you start from observing, which is absolutely true, I realize, because even I knew some of the stories about Prince, that both men felt that they were being robbed all the time, ripped off, and weren't getting as much money as they deserved.
And of course, all artists are like that to a certain extent, but I think that those stories about both of them are quite famous. People think of that as part of the whole. I mean, Prince, of course, it sort of scarred the 90s for him. I mean, he didn't have a name because.
Could you tell the viewers roughly what sort of happened?
Well, he signed a massive contract with his record company because basically he saw that Madonna and Michael Jackson were getting these. Was it $3 million or $5 million advances? I can't remember. $3 million, I think. And he was convinced that he was the greater artist. And, I think he was probably right. So he wanted something that was the equal of his peers. But the contract he signed meant that he could only ever make that money if sales were at a certain point, which he'd already sort of passed. So it went wrong quite quickly. And at the same time, he produced so much that he kept giving them another album and saying, look, I've got another one. And them saying, do you know how long it takes to promote and market an album? And he was saying, I don't care. I want one out in 2 months' time. So when they wouldn't do it, he felt trapped. And I have to say, reading the whole story, I felt more sorry for the record company than I thought I would. So he changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol, and for a while wrote the word slave on his cheek, which was possibly extremely ill-advised. And I mean, God knows what would happen if he did it now.
Yes.
Well, at the same time, of course, being very rich and having this back catalogue, and this was at a time where people were still buying physical copies of albums. Dickens just was ripped off, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was ripped off. He was ripped off, as you say, particularly, he was ripped off by all sorts of imitators and plagiarists, in effect, who did plays and spin-off novels, and there were no good laws stopping them doing that without giving him any money. And also he was ripped off by lots of American publishers who could...
The American thing was extraordinary. That they published him without any contract or any permission. And the first time he went to America and he dared to raise the subject, he was rounded on for being vulgar, and people wrote editorials saying, we don't want your sort round here. And I was very amused to see that the only court case in America involving Dickens was between two rival publishers, neither of whom had the permission in the first place.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it definitely, in Dickens's life and in his sort of literary life, it so much shaped what he was doing.
Yes.
So he would, I don't know, when he started off that extraordinary journal magazine all the year round where Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations were published, it was because the one he did before, he thought, that the publisher was taking too big a share of the profits. So he'd start a new one. He was just always... And the whole, I guess, serialization thing was a method that he perfected to get the maximum readership and the maximum profit. And you're very sort of, I think actually the surprising thing you do in your book is you make me, I've always been slightly sympathetic to Dickens and the way that he behaved over money, actually, but you made me quite sympathetic to Prince, or you made me understand what
Yeah.
to onlookers seemed a rather absurd chapter of his life.
Yes, he didn't think it was absurd. We should point out, and I don't think he
Yes.
ever regretted it. And what was interesting about Prince is some of the decisions he made in the 21st century about business were incredibly prophetic. There's some of that he played 31 nights at the Millennium Dome in London, O2, which is 12,000, I think it's 12,000 or 15,000 capacity, and he sold out 31 nights. He gave his album away with the Daily Mail. And no one had ever done anything like this before. But what he realized was that the recordings were becoming not worth very much at all, whereas the live shows were the way of making money. And I think everyone has come round to that way of thinking now. If they could give things away in newspapers, they would. But of course, all you need is links to streamers. And the other thing that I found quite amusing was that Dickens ended up making money through reading his greatest hits, basically, that his readings were all his best characters, a bit from here and a bit from there. And that sense of what we do now, of what I'm doing now, of promoting a book and only promoting that book. He didn't do that. When Prince went from playing his new album, which nobody was that interested in, which affected ticket sales, to playing everything he'd ever done and finding a huge new audience as a result. So their business sense, it kind of drove them to a difficult degree, but they did discover things about how the world worked.
Yeah. No, I absolutely, I mean, I'm afraid I have crassly reached for the analogy when explaining what Dickens did say to some of my students, his American reading tour. And I do, the only analogy is with a pop star or a pop on tour. I say it is like a pop star doing a different American city every night until they finally are exhausted, but their bank balance is replenished.
I can only think of Dickens and Oscar Wilde who did that. Is that right?
I don't know of any. No, I don't know of any others who did it. And Oscar Wilde did do it, but much less extensively. And of course, he felt very much that his personality was what he was selling.
That was it. Yes.
And I think Dickens was doing that, but of course also thought, rightly, that, as it were, nobody could read his books as well as he could, that if you want Paul Dombey's death, I'm going to really give it to you as you should have it.
It's very interesting what's happening with, like this ABBA show where avatars are being used, and apparently it's spectacular.
Yes.
And I can imagine this happening more and more with rock stars who are no longer with us, in fact, and I'm sure someone will try a Prince one. But it would be interesting to see how long it takes to get to a Dickens. But trouble is, we have a film of him.
Well, like Prince turning up. I mean, obviously, Dickens, generally speaking, didn't turn up unexpectedly in the way that you describe Prince doing, but he went to. It wasn't all in grand places, as it were. I mean, there were plenty of people in Preston and Bolton in the 1860s who got to see Dickens doing, a generous couple of hours or so of readings for his novels. I mean, it must have been an incredible thing.
Yes, and one can only. Of course, those northern cities were much wealthier then.
True.
Than they are now,
yes.
Right? So there would possibly have been more of a reading public than you might have expected. But no, I think in the Dickens Museum there's a map that lays out some of the tours, and you get very tired looking at it.
Yeah, and I mean, did Prince have this thing that Dickens had, that he did, you know, they did their shows for the same reason, which was that it was a way of making money.
Yeah.
But also Dickens was addicted to the instant responsiveness of the audience, you know, and all his life, as of course you know, he was addicted to the responsiveness of his readers, and that was why serialization was so satisfying, because he could trace the increasing sales figures, you know, month by month. But also, I do think he was really addicted to seeing their faces, seeing the women faint when he did Sykes beating Nancy to death, and hearing the roars of applause and the laughter and all that stuff. I mean, was Prince addicted to live performances in that way of feeling the responsiveness of the fans?
Yes, I think so. I think that his stage shows, you can see that he's playing with the audience, and that he looks at people in the audience. You can see that there's a flirtations going on. But in terms of being addicted to live performance, this extraordinary thing that wherever he was, and he played a 2-hour, 3-hour show, he would go off and find a club and take a whole band there and play another show. And there was a quote from one of the backing singers that I used in the book, where she said the crowd used to, this small crowd in a small London club or a small New York club would chant 6 in the morning. That's what they wanted. And she's there thinking, Jesus Christ, you know, this is my 5th hour on stage tonight or whatever. And Prince would just do it and love doing it. And there are some pretty spectacular recordings from some of those places. He typically did a lot of covers. You know, he'd do rock covers and soul covers, and invite local musicians that he admired to join him on stage. But there's a footnote in there. American viewers won't know the name, but a radio journalist, Nick Robinson, who's quite a well-known voice in
very well-known, yeah,
very well-known voice. He went to a club near his house in North London, and he and his wife and friends had booked tickets for an 80s disco, I think, for his 40th birthday. And the guy at the door said, "Oh, I'm sorry, that's not on tonight, and you can have your money back." And they said, "Well, no, we've got everyone here now." They said, "Well, it's more, it's 20 quid, not 10 quid. And they said, "Okay." And it was a Prince show at 12 o'clock in a dance club in Islington.
And you saw Prince yourself, Nick?
I did. I never saw. This is my regret, in the same way that Leah has a regret, which she was telling us before we started, of not having gone. My regret is not being more assiduous in hunting down the after show parties. But yes, I saw him 3 times, I think.
Right. Okay. So all over the years, or in a concentrated bout of...
There's probably 180s, 190s, 190s.
So they were all very different shows.
They were different shows, but unfortunately, the first one I saw was one of the best shows I've ever seen, and I went back to try and recapture that. But the second one was kind of a bit daft, and cars came onto the stage and beds came down from the ceiling. Whereas the first one was a pure soul review, where he didn't even leave gaps between songs. It was just segued straight into the next with this fantastic band. And they were all rehearsed to within an inch of their life. However many songs they played, however much he switched the set around, that they were so on it. And I guess he was quite a fierce taskmaster.
Yes. Well, one of the effects of your book was to make me regret my indolence and folly in never having gone to see Prince. But regretting my indolence and folly is a pretty daily event.
Yes.
I mean, talking about this did make me think that the money, just to nail it for a second, the money aspect and their preoccupation with money also seems so much to do with, well, not just where we started, the aspect, the product of their own childhoods and they're making themselves, but also in a way, it's a way of measuring your appeal, isn't it? I mean, it seems to me that with both of them, it wasn't just they wanted loads of money so that they could, I don't know, go to Bali on holiday or whatever very, very rich people spend their money on, or build an underground swimming pool, or I think that's what very rich people do, isn't it? But it was it seems to have been for Prince, as your description of this argument over contracts and so on, what I feel it was for Dickens, which was a sign of a sign of how much you mattered to people, a sign of what your reach was.
I mean, first of all, it's how much do you love me, as in the people paying for me. How much do you love me? And also, once you get to a certain point, I think, wanting to test out your worth in as many different ways as you can. So they wanted more readers, more listeners, bigger shows, and they wanted to do better than what they saw as their rivals or competitors. I think they were both reasonably generous to other musicians, and they admired Prince admired musicians, and Dickens admired other writers. But I think that there was a fierce competitive edge, and money is one of the ways that you can prove that you have that edge.
Yes. And that sense of being self-made, if I can slip in, this is my one anecdote. I came across recently a letter from Dickens that I hadn't come across before, which is just in the possession of Trinity Hall, Cambridge College, because his son, Henry, one of his many sons, went there. And Henry was the only one who was a big success. He became a High Court judge eventually, and he studied law at Cambridge. Yeah. And most of his sons were pretty feckless, but it was a lot of that. Dickens wasn't a very good dad. But anyway, there's this letter, and it's the letter he wrote to Henry when he went to university for the first time. And it's in, I think it's published. I recommend it to you, Nick, because it's such a insight into what you've been talking about with him. Because first of all, he says, I've given you for your first term 3 crates of brandy, 5 crates of claret, 3 crates of whiskey. This is as it were for term 1, and they're all held in the college. Yeah.
Fresh week, yeah.
And then he says something like, I've given you a generous allowance. And then he says, don't come to me for any more. And then he says something like, and I imagine poor Henry must have been hearing this every month of his life, for every penny I have, I made for myself. No one has ever given me anything. Think about that, and he's still banging on about it to his son, who knows very, very well all of this.
It's I think it's something that the children of successful people will always struggle with, and Dickens was maybe one of the first who had that problem with children he couldn't make work because they knew that there was money slushing around at home anyway.
Yes. Well, I wonder if we could, talk a bit about, I suppose, their deaths, because right at the beginning of your book, at the end of the first chapter, after you talked about their unstoppable work that they did, and their copiousness, their productivity, their hunger to make the next thing. You ask it as a question, I think, in your first chapter. Yes. Did it kill them?
Did it kill them? Yes.
I mean, what's the answer to that, Nick? Do you think it killed them?
Yeah, I think it almost certainly did. It's hard to imagine that. I think Dickens was not the healthiest of men, but it's impossible to imagine that if he hadn't done all those things, he wouldn't have lived a bit longer. I mean, a very complicated domestic life at the time, and the number of times he went to France to see his mistress, and which wasn't an easy journey. It was sort of scores of times that he went. The walking, the letters, the books, the editorships, the drinking, the partying, the putting on plays, and then a massive stroke, basically, yeah?
Yes.
And Prince's was slightly different because he died of an opioid overdose, but the reason he started taking the opioids was hips and knees, which came from constant performing, troubles with hips and knees. And it's very striking that they died, as it were, within a few months of each other, and something like 6 months in the same year of their lives. And a friend of mine talks about Sniper's Alley, that if you can get through this period of your life, when you reach a certain age and come out the other side, you're likely to live a long and happy get to a long and happy old age. But that period is very dangerous, especially for men, and they both didn't make it through Sniper's Alley.
Right. So they, in a way, they did that creativity that they shared was a kind of fierce thing which burnt them out.
Absolutely, yeah. And I've quite often noticed in the field of sport that if someone starts very young in sport, they tend not to go on way into their 30s. If they start at 16, 17, that for one reason or another, injury or simple burnout mentally, that by the time they're 28, 29, they're not what they were. And I think that Dickens and Prince, they had 40 years of their profession, but that 40 years contained about 80 years. So
yes.
It really is like dog years or something.
Well, just to end with, I mean, we were talking earlier before we went on air. I was talking about how Tolstoy always had Dickens's portrait above his desk, and you say at the end of your book that you've got Dickens and Prince above your desk, as it were. Is that right? So I mean, they're quite sort of demanding examples to look up to. What do you do? Is that how you look up to them? Why are they there?
Work. Yeah. I want to work, and I want to do the next thing. And I still feel that I have a lot of ideas that I won't get through, that I'll be dead before I've exhausted what it is I've got in me. So I've got to get on with it. And I find that the copiousness, I find it much more inspiring than the perfectionism.
Okay, great. Well, look, thank you very much for talking with us.
It was really interesting.
And we all want you to get on and get moving, get working, and produce something that I can interview you about again, because I'm addicted to work too in a different way.
Yeah.
But I need people like you to write stuff so I can do it.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Nick.
Thank you.